Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Manchester is Red podcast. I'm Tyrone Marshall in the host chair today, joined by Samuel Luckhurst on this sunny Friday morning. Samuel, we were both at the 99 premiere as well last night. And we can't say loads about it. There will be a review coming out of it next week and a few features over the next few days from it. But an enjoyable night and a good dose of nostalgia in the week where the current team managed to lose 4-0 to Crystal Palace. It was nice to go back in time for a bit, wasn't it?
Spoiler alert, it ends well for Manchester United 25 years ago. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be someone out there who won't be happy with someone spoiling it somehow. But it's something that's been covered chapter and verse. But there was still reasonably original ways of trying to shed new light on it, new takes on it with the interview. So I think there's due to be a podcast that we're doing dedicated on that next week, but very enjoyable. Quite the guest list when you see David Beckham strolling around. It's not every day that he goes to a film premiere as Hollywood as he is.
No, I know getting Beckham in the print works at View for a film premiere was quite the coup. So yeah, an enjoyable night. And spoiler alert, this weekend probably won't go well for Manchester United. I think it's fair to say, but we're going to look ahead to the Arsenal game and a few other big picture things. I mean, I guess a good place to start this week is probably on the manager. Again, it's been another week kind of dominated by talk around his future, talk around Ten Hag. Even after the nadir of Monday night, the disaster of Monday night, I don't think any of us expected anything else but Ten Hag to be in charge for this weekend. I think we all expect him to still be in charge for the cup final. But it does feel like he's just kind of limping on at the moment. I mean, in a way, Ineos could do with putting clarity on it one way or another, because it felt on Monday night very much like the players are kind of in a position where they're expecting him to go. And that kind of vacuum of is he staying, is he going, doesn't feel like it's really helping anyone at the moment, does it?
No, and it is possible to announce a manager is leaving without immediately sacking him. But I think that possibility has come and gone. You've seen already this season with Liverpool and Jurgen Klopp, and West Ham and David Moyes, to very different circumstances with those clubs and those two managers, that there have been announcements in advance that the manager is leaving. And with West Ham, they possibly waited too long. You look at Liverpool and the way their form has spiralled since the FA Cup quarter final at Old Trafford, and people, of course, now are looking at it and thinking, should they have announced Klopp's departure at the time that they did? Of course, when Sir Alex Ferguson retired, United had already won the league by then. So it's an invidious position for Ten Hag to be in. It's an invidious position for Ineos to be in as well. But the silence is deafening and telling. If he was absolutely certain and assured of being the Manchester United manager next season, we would know about it. The supporters would know about it, because that would have been communicated to us, and it would have been communicated to the fans as well. But it's felt like we've been in a holding pattern for at least a month now, maybe a little bit longer. And as soon as the FA Cup final ends, whatever the result, whether it's good or bad for United, there is going to be an immediate shift onto what is happening with the manager, whether Eric Ten Hag comes into the press conference room at Wembley with the FA Cup or without the FA Cup. He's going to be asked the question every Manchester United fan wants to ask, which is, are you going to be in charge next season? And I suspect we will not know for certainty until that weekend at the earliest. And again, whatever happens in the cup final, there has to be communication from the club that weekend regarding the manager, because the season ends on the Saturday. The Sunday, I mean, I'm sure there'll be some people that if they were to communicate that a manager has gone on the 25th anniversary of the treble, there'd be some people offended by that. I wouldn't be offended by that. I think that would be perverse to treat that date as if it's some date of infinite commemoration and should be untouched. They've got to be very, very decisive with communicating to us, to the supporters, why the manager is staying or why the manager is going. It has to be done by that weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything we hear about Ineos, everything we see from them at the moment suggests they are taking very much a long-term vision here. They're strategic, they're planners, and because of that, you would like to think they have pretty much come to a decision against or for Ten Hag around the manager's position. I mean, surely it is not the case that these final 3 league games can necessarily change anything. The cup final, it can't be as simple as he wins it and he stays, he loses it and he goes, because that just doesn't seem to fit what we hear about Ratcliffe and Ineos, does it?
No, and United sacked a manager officially 2 days after they last won the FA Cup, who coincidentally happened to be a Dutch Manchester United manager as well. I mean, I did an awful lot of reporting on Mourinho coming in, and I was confident for a good few months that Mourinho was going to be the United manager for the 2016-17 season. But there was still an element of the shock factor after the FA Cup final that it was definitely going to happen, because and that was purely because the BBC did the story, and the BBC don't normally do those stories unless it's beyond watertight. That's their editorial practice, and of course, because the BBC is such a renowned worldwide media organisation, it does feel a bit different when they say that's happening. But a lot of us have been reporting that for many months, weeks. And the difference on this occasion is that I think we all sense that there's going to be a change of manager in the close season. But it is a different dynamic. There's not. I mean, Jose Mourinho is waiting in the wings if they want to give him a call, but I don't think they are. And there's not an obvious candidate to replace Ten Hag. There's not a standout favourite. The bookies' chalkboards, names are changing, names are going up and down every week, it feels like, because Bayern Munich beat Arsenal in the Champions League quarterfinals. Tuchel's stock went up, even though Bayer Leverkusen have won the Bundesliga title. Now Bayern Munich have gone out of Europe, and the manner in which they went out as well, even with Tuchel providing the context on Harry Kane's substitution and Jamal Musiala's substitution, the manner in which they lost that Champions League semi-final to Real Madrid, his odds are probably longer now. So nobody knows for certainty who the next Manchester United manager is going to be. There are plenty of options, but not one that absolutely is as necessary or as obvious as Mourinho in 2016 or Pochettino in late 2018 when Mourinho was sacked. It never happened for Pochettino. Pochettino was again the front runner when Solskjaer was sacked, but that's not the case this time. As I've said before, and I've been quite open about it, as most people know, regarding the need for a managerial change, and I've laid out why. I think it's a weak excuse if you're just keeping a manager because there's not an obvious alternative. I think with Tuchel, there is some sense in going with him, because although he would be short-term, sometimes you've just got to target short-term gains and then wait for maybe 2 or 3 years down the line, and maybe there's a very obvious long-term coach who becomes available. But I don't see an obvious long-term coach available to United at the moment. Ruben Amorim has been linked with Liverpool. Then he has discussions with West Ham. Julian Lopetegui has been linked with United, but he's going to be West Ham manager next season. And as good a coach as Lopetegui is, I never saw him as being... I don't know why his name was on the bookies' chalkboards in regards to United. He was managing Wolves last season. He's going to be managing West Ham next season. So there's a specific criteria for a Manchester United manager, and the majority of names that are appearing in the odds lists are not even going to get a phone call, I would imagine. But who that choice of manager is, and I still suspect there will be a change of manager, it will be fascinating to see who Ineos go with, because I think it's liable to be quite a polarising choice. But when you look at the form this season and just the beyond the form, the number of defeats in the league, the number of defeats overall, going out of Europe altogether before Christmas, the manner in which their defence of the League Cup ended, the absence of a style, the wretched recruitment, the state of the medical department, the issues with training sessions that are aggravating or causing injuries. They need to clean house. And if you're going to clean house, you're going to change chief executive. They've done that. You're going to get rid of the football director, which essentially they did. I know John Murtagh resigned, but they were replacing him, and Dan Ashworth will effectively replace him when he does come in, sporting director. And who's next in line? The manager. There's no inevitability about it, but we are still in this holding pattern.
Yeah. And the flip side to what you say there, that they shouldn't make the decision purely on the lack of alternative candidates, even though that is probably the biggest plus in the keep Ten Hag column, the fact that there isn't an obvious candidate. But you do that, and it gets to October, November last year, and things haven't changed, and you have to change the manager then, and you're in a considerably worse position in terms of picking a new manager, a lack of a pre-season. But we can't get away from the fact that there is a clear candidate. I mean, 2 years ago, for months and months and months, it was Ten Hag or Pochettino, and both felt like pretty reasonable appointments, good appointments at that time, and Ten Hag was for a season. Now, like we say, there's just no obvious candidate. Tuchel's probably the biggest name, the best CV. Doesn't feel like a great fit for Ineos. Then you're looking at Southgate and Potter being up there. I mean, I don't think either would go down particularly well with the fan base. Like you say, be quite polarising. I mean, we are in the realms where if they do change, it's impossible to even predict. You know, those, I would suggest those three are probably heading the betting markets for it. But it could be someone else entirely, couldn't it? Because it's going to be such a difficult decision for that new leadership team to pick a manager when a lot of them, you're looking at them and you're seeing weaknesses rather than strengths, which probably wasn't the case 2 years ago.
Yeah, you've summarised that very well there in terms of the weaknesses standing out more than the strengths, when certainly, I suppose there was an element of that when Ten Hag became the front runner in March 2022, because you thought, crikey, he's managing Ajax. You look at his CV. Okay, he was at Bayern Munich as a reserve coach, so he'll have picked up some pointers from one of the greatest clubs in the world. But managing an Ajax side that at its core had a bunch of Premier League rejects, leading them to Eredivisie title after Eredivisie title. The fact that City had barely signed anyone from the Eredivisie, which again is not a ringing endorsement of that squad. There were, of course, considerable upsides to Ten Hag as well because of the young players and the football Ajax played. So after I spoke to his friend, that was, you know, that shed new light on him, because I wondered, could he be a disciplinarian? Could he get a hold of the egos in the dressing room? And that is not a problem for him whatsoever, as Cristiano Ronaldo has discovered, Marcus Rashford has discovered, Jadon Sancho has discovered, David De Gea discovered as well. And as I said, as we both agree, last season was a very good season, and they, irrespective of what's happened this season, they got that appointment right. It was either going to be him or Pochettino. Pochettino, for me, has been a coach who has been in decline for 5 years, I would say. That fluky spell where Tottenham got to the Champions League final, their league form was pretty abysmal. They finished fourth by default in the Premier League that season. I think they broke double figures for defeats in the Premier League. They were not doing well. He got sacked in November, and his stock has not really recovered since then, even though he was a worthy candidate to permanently replace Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. But now it's also Ineos' credibility that's at stake, because they've talked a really good game, but they need to start playing a really good game, and actions speak louder than words. And already there will be some fans, and I've spoken to one or two this week, who are wondering why there hasn't even been a change of manager to a caretaker manager just for the FA Cup final, to galvanise the squad and to give them possibly a better chance of winning the FA Cup final. So already there's an element of impatience among supporters. And of course, I think it will be far more controversial if they don't sack Ten Hag rather than if they were to sack Ten Hag. you just look at the amount of games they've lost in the league this season. It's 13 Premier League defeats. It's a record in the Premier League era. There are innumerable reasons to change manager. And then they've got to ensure that his replacement ticks, if not all the boxes, then the majority of boxes. Certainly when Pochettino, when Sir Alex Ferguson was essentially endorsing Pochettino for the role in 2016, very quietly, the problem with Pochettino at that time was that he hadn't ticked the box marked silverware, and he didn't until he went to Paris Saint-Germain. And at that point, you kind of dismiss it because it's PSG. Unless you're winning the Champions League with PSG, it feels relatively meaningless. But I don't think they're going to be. They're not in a position they were in 2014, when it felt like whoever they got in, he was going to be an upgrade on David Moyes, because David Moyes should never ever have managed Manchester United. And there were good options. They didn't go for the right one in Louis van Gaal, clearly, but if they had the right people in place doing their jobs properly, then I reckon they could have got a far better alternative. I mean, Klopp was certainly the fans' favourite at that point, and it feels like Manchester United did miss the boat with him somewhere along the line. Now they've got to be very thorough in their due diligence in deciding who the coach is going to be who comes in, and that he's aligned with what they want, and that he feels a good fit, if not a perfect fit for Manchester United, then a good fit. I'd have said that Eddie Howe was not a perfect fit for Newcastle. I think there's always been this assumption with Newcastle appointed managers that they have to be extraordinarily charismatic, and sometimes that charisma can just carry the team forward, and the tactical side is kind of irrelevant. I mean, Kevin Keegan was a perfect example of that. Bobby Robson was a Geordie as well, which made a big difference, which was, I guess, there was a shift there when they appointed Steve Bruce, who was also at Geordie, but was also deeply unpopular because he came in under Mike Ashley, and his stock was not particularly high at the time as well, after having a couple of unfulfilling spells at championship clubs. But appearances do matter, and United need a manager that they can get behind next season. Unfortunately for Erik Ten Hag now, he's not a manager you can get behind anymore. And if they were having this kind of season, but they were winning convincingly, and there was a clear style, and they were more candid about why they're getting injuries, and that they were vowing to make changes here, there and everywhere, and there was this context as well to it. If it was more convincing, and it wasn't as easy to come back with a comeback, then I think people would be understanding of the situation. But that's not the case at all. When they have been winning this season, they've almost always been unconvincing. Their best win of the season in terms of the football they played in it, the performance level, was away to Wolves in February, and they still needed a 97th minute winner because they'd thrown a 3-1 lead away by conceding a goal in the 85th minute and then an equalising goal in the 95th minute. There is not and this has been the case for a number of weeks, there's not a credible case to keep Ten Hag anymore. There have been a few sheep who have suggested, put him under a new structure, give him time, blah, blah, blah. Just look at the evidence on Monday night. I was quite decisive in calling for him to go after the Coventry game or during the Coventry game. And let's face it, we were sat with each other when we looked at him for that 20 odd seconds or maybe longer after Coventry thought they had scored the winning goal in the 121st minute. He looked done.
Yeah.
The United players were by and large statuesque. He was stood motionless with his hands stuffed in his pockets, probably in disbelief, and he looked done. And anyone in that position would have felt and looked exactly the same way. And as I said on Tuesday's podcast, I do have sympathy for him, because it can't be pleasant when you're just stood in the technical area looking as lonesome as he has of late and as powerless as he has of late. But he has brought an awful lot of this upon himself. And whoever the manager is, it needs to be an upgrade, I agree. And Gareth Southgate would not be an upgrade. as far as I'm concerned. Graham Potter would not be an upgrade. I would argue Tuchel would be an upgrade. And sometimes you've just got to get over yourself with the whole long-term thing. Manchester United see themselves as being bracketed with Real Madrid and Bayern Munich. They're the Real Madrid of England or the Bayern Munich of England. But they're not. Real Madrid, if they win the European Cup this month, they'll have won it for the 15th time. That's 5 times as many European Cups as Manchester United. There was a reason why Manchester United signings are not being told to call the club the biggest club in the world anymore, because they're not, and they weren't anyway. Real Madrid have always been bigger than them. But United need to get back to that level where they can be bracketed with Madrid and they can challenge with Madrid. But they're way, way, way off that. And what do Real Madrid often do? They tend to change managers quite regularly. Ancelotti has been there, I think, 3 years come this summer. And that is long-term for Real Madrid. Bayern Munich have changed manager goodness knows how many times since they won the treble in 2013 under Jupp Heynckes. Jupp Heynckes actually came back and won a title. They must have had at least half a dozen managers. And it's only this season that they've had a trophyless season. Before then, they were just winning the Bundesliga every season. And I know it's a different dynamic in the Bundesliga, and it's good that Leverkusen have won it this season just to upset the apple cart and to not make it a predictable campaign. But if you're Real Madrid or Bayern Munich, you're almost always in the latter stages of the Champions League or winning the Champions League. United have not got past, they've got to two Champions League quarterfinals since they last reached the final in 2011. That is dire. So, and they're not even going to be in the Champions League next season. So what are they waiting for, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair enough. That's all for part one. We'll be back after this break for a little bit of transfer chat. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. We don't know who's going to be in charge of United next year. We barely know who's going to be in charge of the transfer window, given the ongoing wait for a sporting director to appear. But it appears that Jason Wilcox is the man at the moment who will be pulling a lot of strings. Obviously, Omar Barada coming in July the 13th, which is kind of middle of the window. So not an ideal situation, but Ineos seem to have their ducks in a row for the transfer window. And Samuel, you've done the story this week about interest in another central defender. If you can fill us all in on the situation there.
I think it'd been done already, but Bremer, the Juventus centre-half, Brazil international, is a 27-year-old, is one that is among the centre-halves of interest. He's got a release clause in his contract next year, so there may be a temptation from Juventus if they were to get a substantial fee to cash in this summer. It would have to be a substantial fee from United's perspective, because Juventus will be back in the Champions League next season, and with the length of it on his contract as well, which is until 2028. He started, I think, in all but one of Juventus' Serie A games this season. United are going to be, they might not even be in Europe next season. So it would be a big fee for a player who is approaching his peak years, possibly, and could get additional prominence at the Copa America this summer if he was to have a starting role or a pivotal role in Brazil's campaign. But they want two centre halves, and it's logical to cast the net pretty wide. Look at, Jared Brathwaite is someone of interest. Of Everton, Edmund Tapsoba at Bayer Leverkusen is another one. That they're not obviously going to sign all of these centre halves, and it's going to be, they're going to have to balance the books as well. They're going to have to sell players, and there's going to be one centre half at least that will have to be sold. Victor Lindelof, preferably from United's perspective. Johnny Evans and Rafael Varane could be released. But it was interesting actually at the 99 Premier, because Matt Hargreaves was there, who's he effectively replaced Matt Judge as the director of transfer negotiations, I think his role is. And from a person in his occupation, his role, there's not great deal, I suppose, you can take away from watching a documentary about a team that swept all upon them in 1999. But what stands out watching the three-part series is the mentality of those players, how they remember the seasons where they didn't win anything more than when they won things, and how the failures, it still haunts them, it still hurts them, and the mentality of that team, that squad, is unrivaled, I think, as far as Manchester United goes. And then you've got Matt Hargreaves, who spent deadline day essentially agreeing 10 million euros to sign Sofian Amrabat. Now, nobody can tell me that he's someone who is brimming with a mentality befitting of Manchester United. He's not lacking commitment, he's not lacking endeavour, but he's not good enough. He should never have been signed. He was only signed because he played for the manager at Utrecht, God knows how many years ago. There are some pointers to take from listening to players who played in that team 25 years ago. When you do your due diligence, you look at, I mean, if they did their due diligence properly, they would never have gone near Aaron Wan-Bissaka in terms of what they want from a proper Manchester United player. They would have thought twice about signing Angel Di Maria, because his path to PSG was blocked that summer because of FFP. So he only went to Man United because United were the only team left bidding at the table. I mean, Alexis Sanchez, he said after one training session he didn't think, he wished he'd stayed at Arsenal, things like that. You've got to do your due diligence. You've got to know as much about these players as possible, and that's another challenge for them in the summer. That I think what they got right in Ten Hag's first summer was the character. Character was as important as quality, and it was especially important that summer because of the rotten apples that were in the dressing room in the 21-22 season. That dressing room has not been totally fumigated, and if anything, it's starting to get a bit worse. But as I said earlier, they have a chance to clean house this summer, and there are a lot of players in that dressing room who should be ahead of the manager in the queue to exit.
Yeah, the key to this window we touched on before is going to be those sales, isn't it? You mentioned Bremer there. He's obviously going to attract a big fee, and United need to find the funds to make big fees work, because they need at least one centre-back. I mean, they've got 6 centre-backs if you include Campoala, but I doubt that close to the first team next season. Like Evans, Varane out of contract, one at least going to be sold. They clearly need another striker. They probably need a right back, probably need a midfielder. Yeah, we know their financial fair play position is pretty tight. They've missed out on the Champions League. Now they might miss out on Europe entirely. And okay, it's less money in the Europa League, but if you think it's a few £1 million a home game just from gate receipts and hospitality and revenue, and you're losing at least 3 group games, it's another 10, 15, 20 million plus maybe that's falling out of the kitty if they miss out on Europe. So the biggest challenge for this new Ineos football structure this summer is going to be selling players, isn't it? And I guess two of the obvious ones are Sancho and Greenwood. Greenwood more difficult to sell. Sancho to Dortmund, there's clearly a willingness from all 3 parties to get that done, even if it's not going to be simple to do, and Sancho would have to take a pay cut to do it. But if they could sell those 2 players for 70, 80 million pound, it'd be a significant start to at least boosting that kitty in the window. But this is an area where they've been notoriously weak for probably a decade now, isn't it?
Oh, it's longer than that, even in terms of their inability to sell or get good fees for players. It's pretty extraordinary that there have only been 5 players in their history who've gone for fees of £25 million and over. Daniel James, David Beckham, Angel Di Maria, Romelu Lukaku, and Cristiano Ronaldo. They've made some dreadful losses on players, and of course the players who are sold this summer, they're not going to get a profit on any of them. But that's not necessarily a complete failing. I mean, Wan-Bissaka is 5 years into a maximum 6-year contract. Of course, they're not going to get anything like £50 million, which is the fee they committed to spending on him overall. Victor Lindelof, I think his fee was rising to £39 million. That was 7 years ago. Again, you're not going to get anywhere near that fee, but you can still get reasonable fees because I'm convinced there is a market for those players. The interesting thing watching Crystal Palace the other night is that, of course, with Oliver Glasson, the manager, and not Roy Hodgson, watching them, you'd think the chances of Wan-Bissaka going there have receded because Palace use wing backs. And if there is one thing that Wan-Bissaka isn't, or sorry, there are two things. He's not a winger and he's not a wing back, but they've rebranded Nathaniel Klein, who was a right back, as a right-sided centre back. And I've said I think I said maybe just over 4 years ago when United had were about to go to Anfield with Kelce, a depleted defence because of injury issues, that they had to consider Wan-Bissaka as a centre back in a back three, and they did have a full back in a back three that day, but it was Luke Shaw, who of course had played there, I think against Barcelona in the Champions League quarter final, and it turns out he's a very good centre back, particularly when he's in a back two. But you could see Wan-Bissaka still working out at Palace in that role. He's a very athletic player. He's very defensively, he's excellent, as we all know. But he's not a modern right back. I think Gary Neville was a more modern right back than Wan-Bissaka, and that was 25 years ago, possibly even longer. But there would still be a market for him. West Ham like the look of him, and of course they've had a change of manager. It's going to be Lopetegui, not David Moyes next season. But there are a number of Premier League clubs who would benefit from having Wan-Bissaka in their team. Lindelof is a ball-playing centre-half who, in a more sedate pace, you could see doing quite well in another Big Five European league, or possibly going back to Portugal, where United signed him from when he was at Benfica. Sancho's resale value is high, as Ten Hag noted last week. The manager situation shouldn't change Sancho's situation. He should just never play for United again, and neither should Greenwood for wildly different reasons between the pair of them. I think with Greenwood, there may be an element of patience because if United are to get a fee for him, it absolutely has to be this summer. And some clubs may decide, give it a bit more time, and then when if he has to be released next summer, then go for him then. But if there's a market for him, if there are teams eager to get him, then you've got to bank a fee. I don't think it'll be a particularly high fee for him because, let's face it, he is damaged goods, having not played for United since January 2022. And the arrest, the court case not going ahead, the charges being dropped. As I said, there was never a trial regarding Mason Greenwood, but there's a reason why he's gone to a pretty mid-table at best La Liga side, and maybe there's a case of some Premier League clubs wait until the dust has settled there. But it's very easy to forget, and I think some unsurprisingly do forget, that the reason why he didn't get reintegrated into the Manchester United squad and has not played for Manchester United in nearly 2.5 years is because of fan power, because they didn't want him playing for them. He was going to be reintegrated into the squad. When that was reported, there was a major backlash, and United abandoned those plans, and that was because of the principled supporters. I don't think they'll necessarily get a big fee for Greenwood. I don't think they can necessarily command a big fee for Greenwood, even though he's still young, and in terms of his talent, what he showcased at United, he was shaping up to be a generational talent. But Sancho is a different case because he will be starting in the Champions League final, most likely at the end of this month. And United have got a couple of windfalls from Dortmund's progression in the competition, which is a bonus for them. It is a win-win situation for United, but not in the usual way you think with Elneny. When you think, well, we could sell him or we could just have him back in the squad. I think they have to see it as win-win in that he's had decent exposure. His resale value is high. Dortmund might want him permanently. If not, there will probably be a market for him. Someone else will take him. But he seems quite wedded to Dortmund, or he claims to be quite wedded to Dortmund, calling it home. So he can go home.
Absolutely. That's all for part. We'll be back after the break to preview the Arsenal game. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. Having already derailed Liverpool's title charge, United can do the same to Arsenal this weekend. If they get a result, I think any kind of result would probably spell the end for Arsenal and essentially crown City champions. But do you give them a prayer of getting that result, Samuel?
I think they'll probably put in a performance because they've tended to do so against the better teams this season. And they lost quite narrowly at Arsenal in September. But Arsenal have been the more accomplished side in all three games they've played against Ten Hag's United. United did them a couple of times, or a few times actually, on the counter-attack in early September last season. I think it would have been their fourth or fifth game of the season. And they were very clinical that day. Arsenal weren't. And I suppose Arsenal fans will point out that they had a goal disallowed at 0-0 that was debatable. I thought it was a foul by Martin Odegaard on Christian Eriksen, but across the three games, Arsenal have been, as I said, the more accomplished team, and this is a serious and steely Arsenal side. It feels like it's the first time that a serious Arsenal side is turning up at Old Trafford in probably the best part of 20 years, in fact. And there's this quirk that they've not won at Old Trafford in the league with a crowd present since September 2006. It's, again, going back to the COVID era, it just goes to show how largely meaningless and misleading those games were that Arsenal did beat United in the league at Old Trafford because the turnstiles were locked. It was just it was easier for footballers to play in that environment than it is now with the adrenaline rush of having a crowd present and that added pressure. And when you look at that Arsenal lineup, if you're a United fan, you have to glance at some of the players quite enviously. I mean, I think it was unforgivable of United in the summer that Bellingham, Kane and Rice all moved clubs, that none of them moved to United. I think if three of the best England players were moving in the summer yesteryear, United would have been snapping up one of them. No question about it. But that's United paid the price for that. Their two main outfield signings in the summer, Mount and Højlund, were not ambitious signings. One was about to enter the last year of his contract at Chelsea. The other one was an unproven and callow striker. Harry Kane has scored more club goals this season than Højlund has scored in his career. And that is an unfair comparison, as Ten Hag said last week, but it is a valid comparison because he's the striker United turned to when they decided very early on not to get involved with Daniel Levy, even though Kane would have absolutely loved to have played for United. And a more bullish United would have made that happen. I'm not convinced it was impossible last year, but more relevantly with Rice, I think he came second in the FWA votes, didn't he, for Player of the Year behind Phil Foden. He has been a transformative signing at Arsenal. He's elevated Arsenal to a different level this season. They're, of course, still second. They're first at the moment, I should say, beg my pardon. But this time last year, their title challenge had practically ended. They are, I would imagine that the title race will go into the final day of the season. And that is a huge credit to Arsenal and the improvements they've made. And a big reason for those improvements is Rice, who is a player who was interested in joining United as well. So that makes it doubly galling for United supporters that they didn't go for that statement signing, that ambitious signing, and settled for someone who, frankly, I don't think many people look at Mason Mount and think he's a central midfielder. And he had an opportunity the other night with Bruno Fernandes injured, having discussed the possibility of not being at United next season, and with him turning 30 in September, Mount got to play in his position, and Mount didn't turn up at Crystal Palace. So it's not shaping up too swimmingly for them this week, but we're only reflecting in reality. Arsenal have lost how many games this season? 5 games in the Premier League, maybe. United have lost 13 games. Arsenal are top of the table. I think the one thing that is stacked in United's favour is that City play first this weekend. They play at Fulham on Saturday lunchtime. And the only time Arsenal have dropped points since the March internationals was on a weekend where City played on the Saturday and Arsenal played on the Sunday. So it's good. There's going to be a hell of a lot of pressure on Arsenal at Old Trafford. And as some have suggested, going off the Liverpool results there, although Old Trafford is not necessarily a cauldron of noise compared to other European grounds, it can still do. It still has a bit of aura about it, and there is still a bit of the fear factor about it that if it does get going, players can go into their shell or they can get stage fright. And I mean, Liverpool were their own worst enemies in the FA Cup and the league games because they just weren't clinical enough, and that's the reason why they're not going to be in the title race come the final week of the season, when probably if they were a clinical side, they absolutely would have been in with a shout of it still. But when you look at the way Arsenal are going about their business, and they're the top scorers in the league as well, I don't see this weekend being a game where they'll struggle for goals or struggle for creating chances. They are a very well-oiled machine at the moment. And although I think City are a more well-oiled machine and will probably win the league again, it's a huge credit to Arsenal that they are running them this close.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking of creating chances, when Arsenal have their 12th shot at the weekend, and I think we all know there will be at least 12 of them, United will have faced more shots than Derby County in 2007-08, who were the worst Premier League team in history, with 1 win from 38 games and 11 points. A pretty damning statistic. No clean sheet in 9 games now. It seems they're conceding more and more by the week. I mean, the defence recently has been disastrous, and obviously a large part of that on Monday was due to Casemiro's presence there. We are recording this before Eric Ten Hag's press conference. We're both off to Carrington shortly to hear from Ten Hag, and maybe the injury situation will have changed, but surely against Arsenal he just cannot play Casemiro at centre half, because after Monday night it is terrifying what they could do. Especially they are so intricate around the opposition penalty area. They just it almost feels like they spin a web at times when they box you in that opposition penalty area. And you fear for Casemiro if he has to play centre half again, don't you?
There was a great tweet from he's a City fan, but it doesn't matter. The Paris Angel on Monday night, when he said reckon Casemiro might be the first player in Barclays history to have to come off with a stitch tonight, and that kind of summarises his performance. I mean, God knows what United's team will look at the weekend. I mean, Roy Keane has said today he'd play a youth team ahead of Casemiro, and Steven said similarly earlier in the week, discussing Louis Jackson, who's only 18 and was 16 when he started in the FA Youth Cup final a couple of years ago. But you want to protect him as well, because he's clearly not ready. He's still physically underdeveloped, and he'd be coming up against the most formidable attack in the league, going off the goals for column. So you don't want to kill him before his career has just got started, but you also don't want Casemiro there. Martinez has been doing ball work this week in training. I don't think Anthony Marshall was visible in any of the training images from. Wow. Yeah, I know, shocking. Just going off topic briefly in terms of injured players coming back. Is that in there yesterday? No, that was May the 2nd. So no, in the latest batch of pictures, Anthony Marshall didn't appear in them. So that's absolutely not a surprise. But they've got this dilemma now with, do we rush defenders back just for a few league games, or do we try and give them as long as possible to recover for the FA Cup final? But do you want players going into an FA Cup final having not played? In Luke Shaw's case, it would be 3.5 months, I think. Martinez, it would be best part of 2 months. There's no sign of Varane in the training imagery, I don't think, this week either. No sign of Lindelof either. They've said these players are expected to come back this month, but when the training imagery was released yesterday, you still saw Toby Collier, Habib Okene, Ethan Wheatley, Harry Amas, and Louis Jackson, and that all but confirms that there are still some very senior players who are not involved in full training. I think Ten Hag said a couple of weeks ago that Shaw was back on the grass, and maybe next week is the week for him to come in, because I don't think it's wise to go into such a huge, significant cup final with, especially a player with Luke Shaw's conditioning and how brittle he has been this season. For him to go into that not having played whatsoever since, I think it would have been February the 18th, wasn't it, the Luton game, I'm pretty sure. And that's when he only lasted a half that day. It's not like he got injured having played a full game, and the previous week he only played a half at Aston Villa as well. So he's only had 90 minutes in roughly almost 3 months to the date. So it's we've obviously got to pick our panel, but I'm holding on that until we've been to Carrington today and had hopefully what is a thorough team news bulletin from Ten Hag.
Yes, certainly I would agree with you. Shaw and Martinez, especially, who've played so rarely, you'd want 45 minutes to an hour, probably at Brighton at least, to kind of build up sharpness ahead of the cup final. I mean, we normally ask for predictions, but it almost feels worthless this weekend. Like we say, it's not impossible United get a result, and Arsenal will be concerned about this game, but it's difficult to really make a case for them. I guess the biggest fear for this week is that all three games look pretty difficult on paper at the moment, and there is a distinct possibility that they don't win again in the league this season, or they don't win again at all this season.
My friend, I've said before on previous podcasts, my friend who sits by the tunnel said after the Burnley draw, that might be our last point this season. And even I thought, no, they'll get something. But I don't think many expected them to get anything from the Palace game, especially when the team sheets dropped. And there won't be many who expect them to get something from Arsenal this weekend, but they have got form for turning up against the bigger teams. They're unbeaten 3 games against Liverpool this season. They beat Villa twice. They were very, somewhat unfortunate to lose to Arsenal. They lost that game very narrowly. But this is a different United from the United of September. It's similar in some ways, but it's still very different, because look how many games they've lost and look at the rut they're in. And is it 2 Premier League wins in the past 10 games now? That Fulham defeat in late February absolutely knocked the stuffing out of them. I mean, the stuffing was knocked out of them 24 hours before, when the club confirmed that Højlund had got injured. And at that point, he was absolutely the one injury they could not afford, because he was scoring goals and they were winning games. It's not, as we've discussed before, football is not complicated. If you've got a striker who's in form, you're liable to win games. And the 1 month that Højlund was in form this season, United won the majority of their games. But with the Palace game, again, just before that, a day before, the one injury United could not afford going into that game was Harry Maguire, and he got injured. And they lost far more convincingly. So in some ways it closed the circle there. But there could be more damage limitation exercises to come. The Brighton game, the final day of the season, has the prospect of being one of those madcap final day results, like Middlesbrough 8, City 1, or was it Stoke 6, Liverpool 1?
Yeah.
Relegated Newcastle beat Tottenham 5-1 in 2016. There is almost always a result where you think, it's just everything goes out the window. It's just completely bonkers. And looking at the way Brighton play, I think that game has the potential to be one. It's not obviously going to lead match of the day, but I think it could be high up the running order if both teams are, if all shots are firing that day anyway. And let's face it, with United, there are always quite a few shots in their games.
Absolutely. I'm sure we can expect more of that on Sunday. That's all for today. Thanks for joining us, Samuel.
Thank you very much, Ty. See you at Carrington.
Yes.